Hello everyone. Welcome to The Missing Link. I know these videos help you drift off to sleep, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with everything mysteries. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. Our mysterious story tonight is the disappearance of the Beaumont children. Now get comfortable and relax, as it's time to fall asleep. The morning of January 26, 1966, began like any other summer day in Somerton Park, South Australia. The air was warm, the sky was crystal blue, and families across Adelaide were preparing to enjoy the public holiday at Glenelg Beach, a popular seaside destination. For Nancy and Jim Beaumont, it was nothing out of the ordinary when their three children, Jane, 9, Anna, 7, and Grant, 4, excitedly announced their plans to take the 5-minute bus ride to the beach, something they had done several times before. Jane, the eldest, was a responsible and independent girl. Her parents had complete trust in her ability to look after her younger siblings, and they had allowed them to go alone with strict instructions to return home by 12:00 p.m. With bare feet, swimsuits tucked under their clothes, and only a few coins in Jane's bag, the three children stepped onto the bus at 10:00 a.m., eager for a carefree day of swimming and sunshine. It was a moment so mundane, so normal, that no one, least of all their parents, could have imagined it would become the beginning of one of Australia's greatest mysteries. As the bus rumbled toward Glenelg Beach, the Beaumont children were seen laughing and chatting with other passengers. They arrived at their destination without issue, blending in with the hundreds of beachgoers enjoying the holiday. Witnesses would later recall seeing them splashing in the water, playing in the sand, and running along the shoreline, just as they had done many times before. Jane, always the little leader, was seen carefully watching over her younger siblings, making sure they stayed close. But sometime between 11:00 a.m. and 12:00 p.m., something changed. The children, who had always been timid around strangers, were spotted in the company of an unknown man, tall, blonde, and lean, appearing to be in his mid-30s. This stranger was seen laughing with them, talking casually, and even playing games. The most chilling part? The Beaumont children did not seem afraid or uncomfortable. They seemed at ease with him, as if they had met him before. Back at home, Nancy Beaumont watched the clock anxiously as 12:00 p.m. came and went without sign of her children. She told herself they had simply lost track of time, enjoying the beach a little longer. But when the next bus arrived at 2:00 p.m. and the children were not on it, her unease turned to full-blown panic. By 3:00 p.m., Jim Beaumont had returned from work to find his wife frantic, scanning the road for any sign of their children. Without hesitation, he jumped in his car and drove straight to Glenelg Beach, certain they had missed the bus and were waiting for him. He scoured the sand, the water, the nearby jetty, calling out their names, searching through the sea of families and beach towels, looking for those three familiar faces. But there was nothing, no sign of Jane, Anna, or Grant. The belongings they had left on the beach, a neatly folded towel, a small bucket, and a pair of sandals, remained untouched. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. By 5:30 p.m., after checking every bus stop, every nearby shop, and even knocking on strangers' doors, Jim and Nancy Beaumont rushed to the Glenelg police station, their voices shaking as they reported their children missing. At first, officers were not overly concerned. It was a public holiday. Perhaps The children had simply gone to a friend's house, lost track of time, or gotten on the wrong bus home. But Nancy knew better. Jane was too responsible to ignore their curfew. She was too mature to make a mistake like that. Something was wrong, and deep in her gut, she already knew it was serious. As the summer sun dipped below the horizon, the realization that the Beaumont children were not coming home began to sink in. Police conducted an initial sweep of the beach, asking lifeguards and shopkeepers if they had seen the children, but the only information they uncovered was the same disturbing detail. The 3 siblings had been seen playing with a strange man. As officers took down witness statements, a deep sense of unease spread through Glenelg. Parents clutched their children's hands a little tighter. Strangers eyed each other with suspicion. A town that had once felt safe and carefree now felt dark and uncertain. By midnight, the search had escalated into one of the largest missing persons cases in Australian history. Hundreds of police officers, volunteers, and concerned citizens scoured Glenelg Beach, nearby parks, train stations, and bus stops. Every hotel and boarding house was checked, and roadblocks were set up to stop every car leaving the area. But there was nothing. No traces, no clues, no evidence of a struggle. As the first light of dawn stretched over Glenelg Beach, the reality became clear. Jane, Anna, and Grant Beaumont had vanished without a trace. As the search for the Beaumont children intensified, investigators turned to witnesses, the hundreds of beachgoers who had been at Glenelg Beach that scorching Australia day. If the children had been seen with someone, police needed to know who he was, what he looked like, and where he had gone. The first reports had already suggested something deeply unnerving. The Beaumont children had been spotted playing with a man, someone they seemed comfortable with. But as detectives pieced together the testimonies, the details only became more disturbing. Multiple people reported seeing the mystery man, described as a tall, thin, blonde-haired male in his mid-30s, well-tanned and athletic in build. One witness, a woman who had been lounging on the sand, recalled watching as the children ran up and down the shore, splashing in the waves, their laughter mixing with the crashing surf. But what caught her attention was the man watching over them, not a father or an older brother, but a stranger. He wasn't just observing, he was actively engaging with them, playing with them, talking to them as though they were familiar. He even helped them build a sandcastle, something a parent might do, yet no one recognized him. A shopkeeper at a nearby bakery later told police that Jane Beaumont had come into the store with her younger siblings around 12:30 p.m. She purchased meat pies and a soft drink. Nothing unusual, except for one troubling detail. Jane paid with a £1 note. That was odd because Nancy Beaumont had only given her coins for the trip. Where had she gotten the extra money? Had the mystery man given it to her? And if so, why? The thought of this unknown figure handing Jane money suggested something far worse. Had he groomed them, lured them in, and gained their trust? More unsettling details emerged. A local postman, who knew the Beaumont children well, swore he had seen them walking along Jetty Road around their 3 p.m, hours after they were supposed to have returned home. But they weren't alone. The same blonde man was with them. Even more troubling was how the children seemed at ease. If they had been kidnapped, why were they not crying out for help? Why had they not run to someone they knew? It was as if they had already fallen under his influence, trusting him completely. The timeline of events became murky. Witnesses provided conflicting reports. Some swore they had seen the children at the beach well past the time they were expected home. Others insisted they had spotted the same man leading them toward the parking lot near the road. A few even claimed to have seen a small blue car speeding away from the area, its driver matching the description of the unknown man. Had the children willingly followed him into a vehicle? Had they been led away slowly, unknowingly walking toward their own disappearance? By the time the sun set over Glenelg Beach, police had a growing but terrifying picture. The Beaumont children had not just disappeared, they had been taken. But what made the case so haunting was how seamless and effortless it seemed. There were no reports of screaming, no sudden panic chases, no physical struggle. Instead, the three siblings had vanished in plain sight, led away by a man who had somehow earned their trust in just a matter of hours. As the investigation continued, police were faced with a crucial question. Who was this man, and how had he gained control over the children so quickly? Little did they know, the answers would never come easily. By the evening of January the 26th, 1966, the quiet suburb of Somerton Park had descended into a state of panic. The Beaumont children were missing, and as the hours stretched into a sleepless night, their desperate parents, Jim and Nancy, could only wait as the police began their first frantic attempts to track them down. Officers worked quickly, conducting door-to-door searches, questioning every resident near the beach, and scanning the roads leading out of Glenelg. But as the search expanded, the terrifying realization set in. There was no trace of Jane, Anna, or Grant. They had simply vanished. By sunrise, what had started as a missing persons report had escalated into one of the largest manhunts in Australian history. Hundreds of police officers, search teams, and volunteers combed through every inch of Glenelg Beach, overturning sand dunes, checking storm drains and rocky inlets, and digging through the underbrush in the hopes of finding any sign of the children. Helicopters were dispatched to scan the coastline from above, while patrol boats scoured the waters for any possible clue. Authorities even dredged nearby lakes and ponds, fearing that the children may have wandered off and drowned. But nothing was found. No footprints, no clothing, no bodies. It was as if the ocean itself had swallowed them whole. The roads leading out of Glenelg became the next focus. Police stopped and searched vehicles, questioning drivers and pedestrians in the hopes of finding someone who had seen the children after their last confirmed sighting. They interviewed bus drivers, shop owners, and beach vendors, anyone who might have interacted with them before they disappeared. But all the leads led to dead ends. The only consistency in the statements was the presence of the unidentified man, the one seen laughing with the children, playing with them, and eventually walking away with them. But beyond his vague description, no one knew who he was or where he had gone. As the hours turned to days, the case was no longer just a local tragedy. It had become a national emergency. News of the missing Beaumont children spread like wildfire, and their faces were soon plastered across every newspaper in Australia. Their innocent smiles stared back from front-page headlines, turning their disappearance into a household conversation. The public was horrified. How could 3 children vanish in broad daylight from a crowded beach, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses, and yet no one saw where they went? The case captured the fears of every Australian parent, sending a wave of paranoia across the country. The police department, desperate for leads, introduced an unprecedented reward, a $250,000 bounty for any information leading to the children's whereabouts. The hotline was flooded with calls, some from concerned citizens, others from crackpots and hoaxers. Dozens of self-proclaimed psychics stepped forward, claiming they had visions of where the children were. But every search based on these tips led to disappointment. Even international experts, including the famous Dutch psychic Gerard Croiset, were consulted, but his visions led nowhere. As the investigation stretched into weeks, police turned their attention to the unknown man last seen with the children. He was now their prime suspect, and finding him became the highest priority. Sketch artists created a composite image which was distributed nationwide, but the search hit a frustrating wall. No one recognized him. Then a breakthrough came, but it only deepened the mystery. Authorities uncovered another chilling piece of evidence. Just months before the Beaumont children disappeared, there had been several reports of a suspicious man approaching young children at Glenelg Beach. The reports described a blonde, athletic man who had attempted to lure kids away from their families, sometimes offering them money or asking for help, carrying things to his car. Some parents had stepped in before anything happened, and the incidents were never fully investigated. But now, in hindsight, it seemed possible, even likely, that this was the same man who had taken Anna and Grant. Despite the exhaustive search efforts, press coverage, and nationwide manhunt, weeks passed without a single trace of the children. The investigation began to slow, and police found themselves grasping at theories, trying to explain how a man could take 3 children and disappear without a single piece of evidence left behind. Was he a skilled predator who had planned the abduction down to the last detail? Had he used a hidden vehicle, a secondary location, or an accomplice? Or had he somehow convinced the children to go willingly, ensuring that no scene of struggle ever took place? By March 1966, 2 months after the Beaumont children vanished, police were no closer to finding answers. Their case files were stacked with witness statements, maps, photographs, and interview transcripts, but the one thing they needed most, a lead, never came. The streets of Somerton Park grew quieter, the once busy beaches now filled with an eerie sense of caution. Parents no longer let their children play unsupervised, and the carefree summers of Glenelg Beach were forever changed. As the days dragged into months, and then years, one horrifying reality became clear. The Beaumont children were gone, and they might never be found. As the years passed with no answers, the disappearance of the Beaumont children became one of the most baffling and haunting mysteries in Australian history. With no bodies, no ransom demands, and no credible sightings, investigators and experts were left with only theories, and some of them were as disturbing as they were perplexing. One of the most widely accepted theories was that the Beaumont children had been abducted by a lone predator, possibly someone who had been watching them for weeks. The eyewitness reports of a mystery man at Glenelg Beach supported this idea. Someone who had managed to gain their trust quickly and seamlessly. But how? Some experts believed the man may have approached them on previous beach visits, slowly grooming them over time until they felt comfortable around him. The fact that Jane Beaumont, the eldest, had seemingly taken charge and interacted with him as if she knew him, suggested that this wasn't a random snatch and grab. It was a calculated abduction, executed with chilling precision. Then came the theory of human trafficking. Some investigators speculated that the children had been taken by a network of criminals involved in child exploitation. The idea was terrifying. If true, it meant the Beaumont children were not just missing, but had been transported far from Adelaide, possibly even out of Australia. This theory was fueled by reports of suspicious individuals frequenting Glenelg Beach in the months leading up to the abduction. But despite extensive international investigations, no solid evidence ever surfaced to confirm the theory. As time went on, more suspects emerged, some of them truly horrifying. One of the most infamous was Bevan Spencer von Einem, a convicted murderer and suspected serial predator known for kidnapping and torturing young boys in the 1970s and 1980s. Von Einem, who was linked to the family murders in Adelaide, bore a striking resemblance to the composite sketch of the Glenelg Beach suspect. Witnesses had also reported seeing a man matching his description lurking near the beach during that time. But when police investigated, they found no conclusive evidence linking him to the Beaumont case. Another disturbing suspect was Arthur Stanley Brown, a man convicted in 1999 for the abduction and murder of 2 young girls in Queensland in 1970. Brown, who had an obsession with children and a history of violent behaviour, was thought to have been in South Australia at the time of the Beaumont's disappearance. Some investigators believed he could have been responsible, but since he was already suffering from advanced dementia by the time he was questioned, no confession ever came. Perhaps the most controversial theory was that the Beaumont children had been victims of an elite pedophile ring, one that allegedly included powerful figures in Australian society. Over the years, various whistleblowers and former police officers came forward with claims of a high-level cover-up, insisting that police had been pressured not to pursue certain leads. Some even alleged that the children had been taken to a secluded property, abused, and later murdered, their bodies buried in a hidden grave that had never been found. But despite multiple searches, no physical evidence ever surfaced to support this dark theory. One of the most chilling leads came in 2013, when 2 brothers came forward with claims that their father, a known child predator, had confessed to killing the Beaumont children back in 1966. They claimed that their father had led them to a secret burial site where the children's bodies had been hidden. A massive excavation followed, but after days of digging, nothing was found. It was yet another false lead in a case riddled with dead ends. As the years turned into decades, the theories continued to evolve, but the truth remained just out of reach. Some believed that the children had been killed the same day they disappeared, their bodies disposed of in a location so remote or well hidden that they would never be found. Others held on to the painful hope that maybe, just maybe, one of them had survived, growing up under a different identity, unaware of their true past. But despite the endless theories, despite the suspects and the nationwide searches, one question remained: who took the Beaumont children, and why? The disappearance of Jane, Anna, and Grant Beaumont was more than just a crime. It became a national trauma, an event so shocking that it altered the fabric of Australian society forever. Before that fateful summer day in 1966, Australia was a place where children could roam freely, where parents allowed their kids to walk to school, play at the park, and spend afternoons at the beach without fear. But after the Beaumont case, that innocence was shattered. The idea that 3 children could vanish in broad daylight, surrounded by hundreds of people, and never be seen again was unthinkable. The realization that a predator could exist, walking among them, unnoticed and untraceable, sent shockwaves across the country. Almost immediately, Australian parents tightened their grip on their children. The days of letting kids explore on their own came to an abrupt end. Families who once left their doors unlocked at night started bolting them shut. The phrase, "stranger danger," became a national warning, an urgent message repeated by teachers, police officers, and news anchors. Parents drilled their children on never talking to strangers, never accepting money or candy, never going anywhere alone. The carefree summers of Glenelg Beach were over. The image of children laughing in the surf was replaced by the haunting fear that another Beaumont case could happen at any moment. For the Beaumont family, life would never be the same. Jim and Nancy Beaumont refused to leave their home, waiting desperately for a phone call, a letter, or a knock on the door. Some sign that their children were still alive. Every time the telephone rang, their hearts leaped with hope, only to be crushed by silence or cruel hoaxes. The case attracted massive media attention, and over the years, they were bombarded with false leads, fake ransom notes, and twisted individuals claiming to have information. Some people even taunted them, sending letters claiming their children were alive and well, only to later reveal it was all a sick joke. As the years dragged on, the pressure of living under the shadow of unspeakable grief took its toll. Jim and Nancy's marriage crumbled under the weight of the tragedy, and they eventually separated, though neither ever truly moved on. Nancy spent the rest of her life avoiding the press, while Jim, though quieter, continued to hold on to hope until his death. They never had closure, never received an answer, and they never stopped believing that, one day, they might learn the truth. The case also led to major changes in law enforcement. The failure to solve the Beaumont disappearance exposed the gaps in Australia's police procedures, particularly when it came to handling missing children cases. Back in 1966, it wasn't uncommon for police to assume that runaways or lost children would eventually return home. But the Beaumont case proved that every missing child case needed to be treated as a potential abduction from the very start. This led to the development of better protocols, faster response times, and stronger coordination between local and national agencies. Even decades later, the case never faded from the public consciousness. Every few years, new theories and discoveries would reignite hope, leading to excavations, interviews, and reopened investigations. In 2013, police conducted an extensive search at a factory site where a man had claimed the children's bodies were buried. But after days of digging, nothing was found. In 2018, another search was launched at a property once owned by a suspected pedophile. Again, no evidence was uncovered. Each time, the Beaumont case would make headline news, and the world would once again be reminded of the mystery that remained unsolved. The disappearance of the Beaumont children was more than just a crime. It was a moment in history that left a permanent scar on Australia's soul. It changed how parents raised their children, how police responded to missing persons, and how society viewed safety itself. It became the case that haunted a nation, a story whispered at night, a reminder that sometimes monsters do not hide in the dark. They walk among us in the light of day. And yet, after all these years, the most agonizing question still remains. What really happened to Jane, Anna, and Grant Beaumont? Even decades after the disappearance of Jane, Anna, and Grant Beaumont, the case remained a living mystery, an open wound that never truly healed. With no bodies, no definitive suspects, and no concrete evidence, every few years would bring a new lead, a new witness, or a shocking revelation, only for each one to end in frustration and heartbreak. The case became a phantom, haunting investigators and the public alike, refusing to let go. One of the earliest false hopes came in 1968, just 2 years after the children vanished. A Dutch clairvoyant, Gerard Croiset, claimed to have had visions of the Beaumont children's final resting place. According to Croiset, the bodies were buried beneath a recently constructed warehouse in Somerton Park, just a few miles from their home. His description was so detailed and convincing that police organized an excavation of the site. But after hours of digging through concrete and dirt, they found nothing. It was the first of many dead ends, yet it wouldn't be the last. As time went on, reported sightings of the Beaumont children began to surface, some from within Australia, others from as far away as Europe. In the early 1970s, multiple people came forward claiming to have seen Jane, Anna, and Grant living with a strange couple in a rural town. But every time police investigated, it turned out to be another case of mistaken identity. Other sightings claimed the children had been raised under new identities, their memories wiped or manipulated. But none of these leads ever held weight. One of the most disturbing reports came in 1980, when an anonymous letter arrived at the Beaumont family home. The writer claimed to be Jane Beaumont, now an adult, living under a new identity and desperate to come home. The letter pleaded for help, explaining that Jane and her siblings had been kidnapped, separated, and forced to live different lives. At first, Jim and Nancy Beaumont were hopeful. This was the closest they had ever come to an answer. But before anything could be confirmed, a second letter arrived, this time from a different person, claiming the first letter had been a hoax. Investigators traced the letters to a troubled young man, someone who had never met the Beaumonts, but had found some twisted enjoyment in toying with their pain. It was yet another cruel trick, and it crushed the last shred of hope the family had been holding on to. In 2013, almost 50 years after the children disappeared, two brothers came forward with a horrifying claim. Their father, a known child predator, had confessed to murdering the Beaumont children in 1906 and burying their bodies under a factory site in North Plimpton. The story was chilling, and for the first time in years, it felt like a real break in the case. Police launched a full-scale excavation, bringing in heavy machinery to dig up the ground beneath the old building. But once again, after days of searching, they found nothing. Another promising lead had collapsed into another disappointment. The most recent significant development came in 2018, when investigators re-examined a potential suspect, Harry Phipps, a wealthy Adelaide businessman with a dark history of violence and child abuse. New witness statements suggested that Phipps had been in Glenelg on the day of the disappearance, and that he may have lured the children to his home under false pretenses. Even more disturbingly, Phipps owned a large industrial property, where his own son later claimed he had seen him digging a deep hole around the time the Beaumonts disappeared. Once again, investigators launched an excavation, and once again, nothing was found. With every failed search, with every false sighting, dead-end tip, and cruel hoax, the reality became more painful. The truth might never be found. The case, once the focus of national obsession, slowly began to fade into history, its files collecting dust in the cold storage of police archives. Investigators who had worked on the case for decades retired or passed away, leaving the mystery in the hands of a new generation, a generation that, despite the advances in DNA analysis, forensic technology, and investigative techniques, was still no closer to finding the truth than they had been in 1906. By the time Nancy and Jim Beaumont passed away, they had spent over 50 years in agony, never knowing what had happened to their children. They died with the same unanswered questions, the same haunting thoughts that had plagued them for decades. Were Jane, Anna, and Grant taken far away? Were they alive for days, weeks, or years before meeting their fate? Were their final moments painful? Were they buried in an unmarked grave or marked grave in lost to time? Even today, the disappearance of the Beaumont children remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in Australian history. It is a constant reminder of how evil can lurk in broad daylight, how an ordinary day can turn into an unspeakable nightmare, and how, even with all the resources in the world, some mysteries refuse to be solved. And perhaps the most terrifying thought of all, somewhere out there, the person responsible may still be alive, still keeping their secret, still walking free among us. This concludes our story today, so sink deeper into your comfy bed, dim the lights even more, and drift into the perfect rest that you deserve, as your narrator has you. Sweet dreams, and thanks for tuning into the Missing Link channel. On the afternoon of November 24th, 1971, a mystery man in a black suit, dark sunglasses, and a thin black tie walked into Portland International Airport and approached the ticket counter for Northwest Orient Airlines. He was calm, quiet, and unremarkable, blending in with the pre-holiday travelers heading home for Thanksgiving. He bought a one-way ticket for $20 in cash, no ID required, under the name Dan Cooper, and boarded Flight 305, a short 30-minute flight bound for Seattle. The aircraft, a Boeing 727, was moderately full, carrying 36 passengers and 6 crew members. To the airline staff, Cooper appeared to be just another businessman, perhaps a corporate executive or a traveling salesman. But as the flight took off at 2:50 p.m., he sat in seat 18C, close to the rear of the plane, holding a black briefcase that contained a terrifying secret. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper did something that would change aviation history forever. He leaned toward a flight attendant, Florence Schaffner, and handed her a small slip of paper. Used to being handed phone numbers from male passengers, she casually tucked the note into her pocket without reading it. But Cooper leaned in again and whispered, "Miss, you better read that note. I have a bomb." Schaffner's face went pale as she unfolded the paper, which contained a simple but chilling message. "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I want $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle. No funny business, or I'll do what I have to." Cooper then calmly opened his briefcase, revealing a bundle of red cylinders connected by wires, enough to convince her that he wasn't bluffing. Schaffner, keeping her composure, nodded silently and walked toward the cockpit to inform Captain William Scott of the hijacker's demands. Inside the plane, passengers remained unaware of the unfolding nightmare. The crew, trained for emergencies, followed protocol, relaying the hijacker's demands to air traffic control. Back on the ground, law enforcement scrambled to coordinate a response. The FBI, Seattle Police, and Northwest Orient executives debated whether to comply with the demands or attempt a risky maneuver to subdue the hijacker. But Cooper had been careful in his wording. He had asked for 4 parachutes, not 1. This suggested that he might be forcing a hostage to jump with him, making any attempt to give him a sabotage parachute too dangerous. The authorities had no choice but to comply. Meanwhile, back on Flight 305, Cooper remained unshaken and polite. He lit a cigarette, ordered a bourbon and soda, and sat back as if he were on a normal business trip. When flight attendant Tina Mucklow sat beside him, he spoke softly and respectfully, even offering to pay for his drink. He was not nervous, not erratic, and not rushed. He was completely in control. When Mucklow later described him, she would say that he wasn't cruel or aggressive, but instead thoughtful, intelligent, and oddly kind. For nearly 2 hours, the plane circled Puget Sound, giving authorities enough time to gather the ransom money and prepare the parachutes. At 5:39 p.m., Flight 305 finally landed at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Outside, a bright red fuel truck waited near the tarmac, along with dozens of FBI agents hiding in unmarked vehicles, watching the plane's every move. Cooper, careful and calculated, refused to let the crew open the doors until he was sure that the ransom and parachutes had been delivered exactly as he had requested. Finally, an airline official approached the aircraft, carrying a duffel bag filled with 10,000 $20 bills, each one carefully photographed and recorded by the FBI. They also delivered 2 front parachutes and 2 reserve chutes as requested. Once Cooper was satisfied, he released all 36 passengers, keeping only the pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and Tina Mucklow on board. The relieved passengers hurried down the stairs to safety, unaware that the most daring part of the hijacking was yet to come. Now alone with the crew, Cooper's next instructions shocked everyone. He demanded that the plane take off again, this time with the rear staircase unlocked and lowered mid-flight. He told the pilots to fly low and slow, heading toward Mexico City at a strict 10,000-foot altitude, with the landing gear stuck down to reduce speed. The crew protested, explaining that such a flight plan was extremely dangerous, but Cooper remained calm and firm. At 7:40 p.m., under the cover of night, Flight 305 took off once more, heading south toward Reno, Nevada, as a refueling stop before Mexico. The crew, forced to stay in the cockpit, could only wait and wonder, what was Cooper planning next? Less than an hour later, somewhere over the dense forests of southwestern Washington, D.B. Cooper vanished into the night, taking $200,000 and his secrets with him. As Flight 305 soared into the black night sky, the stakes had never been higher. The passengers were safe, but the mystery hijacker, now alone with the flight crew, was far from finished. He had everything he needed: $200,000 in small bills, 4 parachutes, and a fully fueled Boeing 727 at his command. But what he did next would cement his name as one of the most legendary criminals in history. As the plane climbed to 10,000 feet, Cooper ordered flight attendant Tina Mucklow to stay in the cockpit with the rest of the crew. His voice was calm but firm, and he made it clear no one was to exit the cockpit under any circumstances. Before locking the door behind her, Mucklow caught a glimpse of Cooper as he knelt in the dimly lit cabin, methodically strapping the ransom money to his body and inspecting the parachutes. It was the last time anyone would ever see him. With the cockpit door sealed shut, the crew had no way of knowing what was happening behind them. But at 8:00 p.m., a warning light flashed in the control panel. Cooper had lowered the rear air stair mid-flight. This feature of the Boeing 727 was unusual. It allowed the plane to be boarded from the rear while on the ground, but it had never been used mid-air before. Cooper had clearly done his homework. The pilots immediately radioed Cooper, asking if he needed help. His response was short and final: no. Then, silence. For several tense minutes, nothing happened. The only sound was the roar of the wind whipping through the open staircase. The pilots maintained their course, flying at a steady 200 miles per hour, holding their altitude at 10,000 feet, exactly as Cooper had demanded. Then, at 8:13 p.m., the entire aircraft lurched violently. as if it had suddenly lost a great deal of weight. The plane tilted upward for a brief moment, forcing the pilots to counteract the sudden shift in balance. The crew immediately suspected what had happened. D.B. Cooper had jumped. Somewhere over the dense wilderness of southwestern Washington, in the middle of a raging storm, a man in a business suit and sunglasses leaped into complete darkness, carrying a bulky bag filled with $200,000 strapped to his body. The night sky was pitch black, the ground miles below, the wind howling at near freezing temperatures. And yet, Cooper had vanished without hesitation. For the next 5 minutes, the flight crew anxiously awaited a follow-up transmission from Cooper, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he had changed his mind and was still on board. But as the minutes passed, it became clear. He was gone. At 10:15 p.m., nearly 2 hours after Cooper had vanished, Flight 305 safely landed at Reno Tahoe International Airport. FBI agents and law enforcement stormed the plane, searching every inch of the cabin, the cargo hold, and even the mechanical compartments. But there was no trace of Cooper. All that remained were 2 of the 4 parachutes, a black tie, and a handful of cigarette butts. The man who had held an entire aircraft hostage extorted $200,000 and pulled off a daring mid-air escape had seemingly disappeared into thin air. But the real mystery was only just beginning. The moment Flight 305 touched down in Reno, the FBI's massive investigation was already in motion. Agents swarmed the plane, searching every inch of the cabin, cargo hold, and landing gear. But as expected, D.B. Cooper was gone. What he left behind was frustratingly little. A black clip-on tie, an empty tie clasp, 8 Raleigh cigarette butts, and 2 of the 4 parachutes, one of which had been cut open, likely to secure the ransom money to his body. The FBI immediately launched one of the largest manhunts in U.S. history, codenamed NORJAC, Northwest Hijacking. The first priority was determining where Cooper had landed. With no exact coordinates, investigators turned to the pilots, who recalled feeling the plane lurch at exactly 8:13 p.m., the moment Cooper likely jumped into the stormy night. Using flight path data, wind speed calculations, and reports from military radar stations, authorities estimated that Cooper had landed somewhere in the dense forests of southwestern Washington, near the Lewis River and Mount St. Helens. By daybreak, search teams, including FBI agents, state troopers, local police, and even military personnel, began combing through the rugged terrain, hoping to find a parachute, footprints, money, or even a body. Helicopters hovered over the tree line. Boats patrolled the Columbia River, and bloodhounds were deployed to sniff for any human scent. But the conditions were brutal. Freezing temperatures, heavy rain, and miles of uninhabited wilderness made the search incredibly difficult. Despite weeks of intense efforts, they found nothing. Meanwhile, FBI agents focused on another critical angle. Who was D.B. Cooper? Since he had paid for his ticket in cash and given a fake name, Dan Cooper, they had very little to go on. They interviewed all 36 passengers, the flight crew, and airport staff. But Cooper had been so unremarkable that few people remembered much about him. The best description came from flight attendant Tina Mucklow, who had spent the most time with him. Height, around 5'10" to 6'0". Weight, approximately 170 to 180 pounds. Age, between mid-40s to early 50s. Appearance, Caucasian, dark hair with some graying at the temples, brown eyes, no noticeable scars or tattoos. Clothing, black suit, white shirt, black tie, loafers, sunglasses. Despite this detailed description, there were no immediate matches. The FBI checked known criminals, military records, and missing persons databases, but no one fit the exact profile. As investigators scrambled for leads, the media latched onto the story, turning D.B. Cooper into a folk legend overnight. In an early miscommunication, a journalist mistakenly reported his name as D.B. Cooper instead of Dan Cooper, and the name stuck forever. For months, the FBI pursued every possible lead. Tips flooded in from across the country, with people claiming to have seen Cooper in bars, motels, and small towns. Dozens of men resembling his description were investigated. Some even voluntarily came forward to prove their innocence. But nothing concrete ever surfaced. By the spring of 1972, nearly 6 months after the hijacking, the investigation hit a dead end. No parachute, no body, no ransom money. The FBI was left with only questions. Did Cooper survive the jump, or did he die in the wilderness? If he survived, where did he go? Why hadn't the money been spent or surfaced anywhere? With no solid answers, the greatest manhunt in US history had come up empty. But then, nearly a decade later, the case took a shocking turn. In 1980, a young boy named Brian Ingram, vacationing with his family near Tenaba on the Columbia River, stumbled upon 3 decayed bundles of cash buried in the sand. When investigators examined the rotting $20 bills, they were stunned. The serial numbers matched Cooper's ransom money. For the first time in 9 years, the world had a tangible clue. But instead of solving the mystery, it only made things more confusing. How did the money end up buried miles from the FBI's predicted landing zone? Did Cooper survive the jump but lose part of his ransom? Or had someone else found it and hidden it there? The discovery reignited the case, and the FBI resumed its search with new urgency. But despite more excavations, more forensic testing, and more theories, no further money was ever found, and Cooper's fate remained a chilling mystery. The greatest criminal escape in aviation history had seemingly been pulled off flawlessly, and D.B. Cooper was still nowhere to be found. As years turned into decades, the hunt for D.B. Cooper became more than just a criminal investigation. It became an obsession. The FBI, private investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths all tried to piece together the identity of the man who had pulled off the most daring heist in aviation history. Since no body, parachute, or majority of the ransom money was ever found, theories about what really happened to Cooper ran wild. Some believed he had died in the jump, his remains lost in the rugged wilderness of Washington. Others insisted that he had survived and was living under a new identity, spending his stolen fortune in secrecy. But without concrete answers, one question remained at the center of it all. Who was D.B. Cooper? Over the years, law enforcement and independent researchers investigated dozens of potential suspects. Some were compelling, some were outrageous, but none could be definitively proven to be the elusive hijacker, Robert Rackstraw. The ex-military conman, one of the most famous suspects, was Robert Rackstraw, a former army paratrooper and explosives expert with a history of fraud and deception. Rackstraw had the perfect skill set to be Cooper. He knew how to jump from planes, he had survival training, and he had a criminal background. Investigators found that Rackstraw had lied about his military records, used multiple fake identities, and had even faked his own death at one point. When questioned about being Cooper, he never outright denied it. Instead, he would smirk and say things like, "I could be." In the early 2000s, Independent researchers studying letters allegedly sent by Cooper after the hijacking claimed they had uncovered coded messages hidden within the text, and those messages allegedly pointed directly to Rackstraw. However, the FBI never found hard evidence tying him to the case, and he always maintained that he was not Cooper. Rackstraw died in 2018, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. 2. Dwayne Webber, the deathbed confession. In 1995, a man named Dwayne Webber made a shocking statement to his wife just before he died. As he lay on his deathbed, he pulled her close and whispered, "I am Dan Cooper." His wife, puzzled by the confession, began researching the case and realized that her husband had never explained parts of his past. He had scars on his body that suggested he had parachuted before. He had once joked about leaving fingerprints on a hijacked plane, and, most chillingly, he had taken a solo trip to the Columbia River in 1979, just 1 year before the ransom money was found buried there. After his death, his wife reached out to the FBI, hoping they would compare his fingerprints or DNA with the evidence found on the plane. However, the FBI never found a match. To this day, some still believe Dwayne Webber was the real D.B. Cooper, but there's no proof to confirm it. 3. Kenny Christiansen. The Northwest Orient insider Kenny Christiansen was a flight attendant for Northwest Orient Airlines, the same airline Cooper hijacked. He was an ex-paratrooper, had a background in aviation, and, after the hijacking, he suddenly came into a lot of money. A former colleague claimed that, on his deathbed, Christiansen tried to confess to something, but his words were cut off before he could finish. After his death, his family found large stacks of cash hidden in his home, but none of it matched the marked bills from Cooper's ransom. Despite the suspicious circumstances, the FBI never considered him a prime suspect, believing he did not match the hijacker's description. 4. William J. Smith. The airline revenge theory. Another intriguing theory suggests that D.B. Cooper was actually an airline insider seeking revenge on Northwest Orient Airlines. William J. Smith, a former employee of the railroad industry, had extensive knowledge of airline procedures, and some theorists claimed that the name Dan Cooper could be traced back to an old railway work badge that he used in the 1960s. Smith had been through financial hardships, and some believed he orchestrated the hijacking as payback. While this theory gained traction in later years, there was never any hard evidence connecting Smith to the crime. 5. The Cooper died in the jump theory, one of the oldest theories, and the one that the FBI leaned toward for years, was that D.B. Cooper never survived the jump. This theory argues that the stormy weather and high winds would have made a nighttime parachute landing extremely dangerous even for an expert. Cooper jumped wearing loafers and a business suit, which were terrible choices for surviving in the wilderness. He left behind the most reliable parachute, instead choosing a military-grade reserve chute that had no steering capabilities. No confirmed evidence of his survival, like bank transactions with the ransom money, has ever surfaced. If Cooper didn't survive, his body and the money should have been found, but they weren't. Did he land in a river and get washed away? Did animals scatter his remains? Or did he actually manage to walk out of the woods and disappear? The FBI's final verdict, after 45 years, the FBI officially closed the case in 2016, admitting they had exhausted every lead and were no closer to solving the mystery than they had been in 1971. While dozens of suspects had been investigated, there was no definitive proof linking anyone to the hijacking. The only hard evidence, the tie left behind on the plane, contained DNA, but it was too degraded to provide a match. To this day, D.B. Cooper remains unidentified, and no one knows if he survived. But if he did, he would be in his 90s today, potentially living out his final years as the only man to ever pull off a plane hijacking and get away with it. And perhaps the most chilling thought of all, he could still be out there, watching the world debate his legend. For nearly a decade, the FBI searched for any trace of D.B. Cooper, his parachute, his body, or the ransom money. But year after year, the search came up empty. With no credible sightings, no bank activity, and no physical remains, it seemed as if Cooper had vanished into thin air. But then, in 1980, a discovery changed everything and raised even more questions. The Tenor Bar money discovery. On February the 10th, 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was vacationing with his family near Tenor Bar, a sandy riverbank along the Columbia River in Washington, about 20 miles west of where Cooper had supposedly jumped. As he dug into the sand, Brian's hand struck something unusual, a stack of decayed rubber-banded $20 bills. At first, his parents assumed they were old play money or trash, but when they took a closer look, their hearts stopped. The bills were real US currency, waterlogged and disintegrating with age. When the FBI analyzed the money, they made a shocking confirmation. The serial numbers matched the D.B. Cooper ransom money. In total, Brian had uncovered 3 bundles of cash, amounting to $5,800. The bills were charred, crumbling, and stained from years in the elements, but their origin was undeniable. For the first time since the hijacking, a piece of Cooper's loot had resurfaced, but instead of solving the mystery, it only deepened it. Theories about the buried money. The discovery of the Tenor Bar money led to endless speculation about how it got there. Did Cooper bury the money? Some believe Cooper himself buried the cash, either as a backup stash or as a decoy to throw off investigators. But if that was the case, why was only a small portion found? And why so far away from the predicted drop zone? Did the money wash downriver? Another theory suggests that the money fell into the Columbia River after Cooper died during his jump. Water could have carried the bills downstream, where they eventually became buried in the sand. However, hydrologists and forensic experts struggled to explain how the bills ended up in a single neat location, instead of being scattered along the riverbanks. Did someone else find the money first? A chilling theory suggests that someone else stumbled upon Cooper's remains, took most of the cash, and buried the leftover bundles at Tenor Bar. This theory raises an even darker question. Was Cooper already dead when his money was discovered? Despite extensive digging and sonar scans, no additional bills were ever found. To this day, the Tenor Bar discovery remains the only piece of Cooper's ransom ever recovered. Other strange clues. Over the years, more bizarre pieces of evidence surfaced, each one adding to the mystery. The rotating parachute theory. In 2008, a group of amateur investigators claimed to have found Cooper's parachute buried in Washington farmland. But when experts examined it, they determined it was not the same model issued to Cooper in 1971. If Cooper did land safely, where was his real parachute? The titanium particles on Cooper's tie. In 2017, forensic scientists re-examined the black tie Cooper left behind on the plane. Using advanced scanning technology, they discovered titanium particles embedded in the fabric, a metal used in jet manufacturing and high-tech engineering. This led some to theorize that Cooper may have worked in the aerospace industry, giving him insider knowledge on how to pull off the perfect airborne escape. The letter to the Washington Post. Shortly after the hijacking, a mysterious letter was sent to the Washington Post, claiming to be from D.B. Cooper himself. The letter read, "I knew from the start I wouldn't be caught. I didn't leave fingerprints behind because I wore a toupee. I had no real identity. I am not a modern-day Robin Hood, but I had to do it." Handwriting experts determined the note was consistent with other anonymous letters sent after the hijacking, but no definitive connection to Cooper was ever made. The missing ransom money. Of the $200,000 of ransom, only the $5,800 found at Tenor Bar has ever been recovered. None of the remaining 9,710 bills have ever turned up in circulation, a baffling fact that suggests Cooper never spent the money or possibly hid it somewhere unrecovered. The FBI's final conclusion. After more than 45 years of searching, the FBI officially closed the D.B. Cooper case in 2016, stating that they had exhausted all possible leads. The case had become one of the longest-running unsolved crimes in U.S. history, and despite advances in DNA technology, forensic science, and aerial search techniques, the mystery of what really happened to Cooper remained as elusive as ever. Was he buried somewhere in the Washington wilderness? Did he live out the rest of his life in secrecy? Or did he stash his money away for decades, waiting for the world to forget about him? One thing was certain. D.B. Cooper had pulled off the impossible. And if he was still alive, he was watching his legend grow. Even after the FBI officially closed the case in 2016, the story of D.B. Cooper never died. If anything, his mysterious disappearance only fueled his mythical status, turning him into one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. His audacity, precision, and sheer defiance of the law captivated generations of investigators, conspiracy theorists, and everyday thrill seekers. He had done what no one else had before, or since, successfully hijacked a plane, stolen $200,000, and vanished into the night without a trace. As time passed, Cooper's legend evolved beyond just a criminal case. He became a symbol of rebellion, adventure, and the ultimate unsolved puzzle. Unlike most criminals, who are feared and reviled, Cooper was seen by many as a modern-day outlaw, a mysterious anti-hero who had outwitted the system and disappeared into history. Cooper in pop culture. Over the years, books, movies, TV shows, and songs have kept Cooper's story alive, each adding their own twist to the mystery. Films and TV, shows like Prison Break, The Blacklist, and Breaking Bad referenced Cooper's infamous escape. The film Without a Paddle, 2004, humorously imagines that Cooper survived and hid in the woods for decades. Books and documentaries. Dozens of books have been written about the case, with titles like Skyjack, The Hunt for D.B. Cooper and the Last Master Outlaw, diving deep into theories, suspects, and forensic evidence. Music and art. The case has inspired songs, paintings, and even tattoos, proving that Cooper's story has morphed into something larger than life. In 2011, a CooperCon, a convention dedicated to solving the mystery, was launched, where investigators, historians, and amateur sleuths gather annually to discuss new theories, re-examine evidence, and debate who Cooper really was. Theories that refuse to die. Despite the case being officially closed, theories about Cooper's identity and fate continue to circulate the internet, crime forums, and investigative circles. He survived and started a new life. Some believe Cooper escaped successfully, possibly with an inside connection that helped him disappear. He died in the jump. Others insist he miscalculated his landing, drowned in a river, or perished in the wilderness. He was a military or CIA operative. Theories suggest he had special training, explaining how he executed the perfect escape. The government covered up his fate. Some speculate that the FBI knows the truth, but has chosen to bury it. The lasting mystery decades later, no one has ever come forward claiming to be Cooper. None of the remaining ransom money has ever surfaced. His true identity remains unknown. The FBI itself once admitted that D.B. Cooper may have been the only hijacker in history who actually got away with it. Unlike other skyjackers who were either caught or killed, Cooper seemed to have planned every detail perfectly, right down to his legendary disappearance. And that is what makes his story so powerful. He is not just a criminal, he is a ghost. A man who defied the odds, vanished without a trace, and left behind a mystery that will likely never be solved. Even today, somewhere out there, a man could be sitting by a fire, watching the world debate his story, knowing that his legend is still as strong as ever. And maybe, just maybe, he's smiling.
Elena Vasquez had dissected corporate fraud cases for 23 years. Her analytical mind trained to spot deception in spreadsheets and financial statements. Yet nothing in her forensic accounting background prepared her for the peculiar invitation that arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. The envelope bore no return address, only her name written in an archaic script that seemed to dance across the cream-coloured paper. Inside, a single photograph showed a page filled with indecipherable text surrounding botanical illustrations that defied classification. The note, typed on what appeared to be a manual typewriter, read, "Professor Vasquez, your expertise in pattern recognition may unlock what has confounded scholars for centuries. The By-Necker Library, Yale University, Room 102, Thursday, 2 p.m. Come alone." Eleanor's rational mind screamed caution, but curiosity had always been her weakness. She had built her reputation on finding hidden connections in seemingly random data, and this mysterious manuscript represented the ultimate puzzle. After arranging leave from her position at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit, she found herself standing before the imposing Gothic Revival architecture of Yale's rare book library. Room 102 contained a single occupant, a tall woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun, her fingers dancing across a tablet displaying high-resolution scans of manuscript pages. Dr. Miriam Thornfield introduced herself as a paleographer who had spent 15 years studying medieval texts. Her eyes held the particular exhaustion that comes from chasing answers that consistently retreat further into shadow. The Voynich manuscript, Miriam began without preamble, has been carbon dated to the early 15th century. 240 pages of vellum containing over 35,000 words in an unknown script, accompanied by illustrations of plants that don't exist, astronomical charts that correspond to no known celestial patterns, and human figures engaged in activities that border on the incomprehensible. Elena studied the images on the tablet. The text flowed with organic curves and elaborate flourishes, suggesting a living language rather than an elaborate cipher. Yet patterns emerged from the chaos, repeated character combinations, consistent spacing, a rhythm that implied grammatical structure. Her forensic training kicked in automatically, cataloguing potential entry points for analysis. "Why me?" Elena asked. "Surely cryptographers and linguists have examined this extensively." Miriam's smile carried bitter undertones. "They have. The manuscript has been studied by everyone from medieval scholars to computer scientists at the NSA. William Friedman, who broke Japanese diplomatic codes during World War II, spent decades on this text without success. Modern statistical analysis suggests it contains too much entropy to be gibberish, yet too little to be a natural language. It exists in a linguistic twilight zone that shouldn't be possible. The older woman gestured toward the manuscript images. But 3 months ago, I discovered something that changes everything. Hidden within the apparently random distribution of characters, there's a secondary pattern, a mathematical sequence that only becomes visible when you analyze the text using forensic accounting techniques designed to detect sophisticated financial fraud. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. What kind of pattern? The same type of hidden structure used by money launderers to disguise transactions across multiple accounts. Someone, or something, embedded information within this manuscript, using techniques that wouldn't be invented for another 500 years. The question isn't just what the Voynich manuscript says, Elena. The question is who knew enough about information theory in 1404 to create it. Thunder rumbled outside the library windows, and Elena found herself wondering if she was about to step through a door that would fundamentally alter her understanding of history itself. The manuscript pages glowed softly in the afternoon light, their secrets intact after 6 centuries of scrutiny. But now, armed with modern analytical tools and an unconventional perspective, she sensed that those secrets might finally be ready to yield. The game, as someone much more famous than she might have said, was afoot. Elena spent the next 3 weeks in a cramped office adjacent to the Beinecker's conservation lab, surrounded by printouts, statistical analyses, and increasingly complex diagrams that mapped the manuscript's linguistic structure. Her forensic accounting software, originally designed to trace financial crimes across international banking networks, had been reprogrammed to analyze medieval text, with surprising effectiveness. The patterns Miriam had discovered were indeed present, but they formed only the outermost layer of a far more sophisticated system. Elena's background in detecting layered financial deception proved invaluable as she peeled back successive levels of encoding. The Voynich text wasn't simply encrypted, it was architected, constructed according to principles that seemed to anticipate modern information theory by half a millennium. "Look at this," Elena said, pointing to a cluster analysis displayed on her laptop screen. Dr. Thornfield peered over her shoulder, bringing the scent of jasmine perfume and old books. The character frequency distribution follows Zipf's law almost perfectly, which is what you'd expect from natural language. But when I analyse the text using Benford's law, the same principle I use to detect accounting fraud, something extraordinary emerges. The graph on screen showed a series of peaks and valleys that formed an unmistakable pattern. Elena had seen similar structures in her FBI work, always indicating that someone had deliberately manipulated data to hide information within apparently random noise. The manuscript authors understood statistical analysis, Elena continued. They knew that future readers would apply mathematical tools to decode their work, so they embedded multiple layers of misdirection. It's like finding a computer virus written in Latin and hidden inside a medieval cookbook. Miriam frowned at the screen. But that's impossible. The mathematical concepts you're describing weren't formalized until the 19th and 20th centuries. Medieval scholars might have possessed intuitive understanding of patterns, but this level of sophistication suggests knowledge of probability theory, information entropy, and statistical distribution that simply didn't exist in 1404. Unless, Eleanor said slowly, the manuscript wasn't written in 1404. They stared at each other across the cluttered desk. The carbon dating results were unambiguous. The vellum pages had indeed been created in the early 15th century, but carbon dating only confirmed when the writing surface was prepared, not when the text was added. Elena pulled up another analysis. I've been studying the ink composition based on spectroscopic data from the Yale conservation team. The pigments are consistent with medieval materials, but there's something odd about their distribution. The manuscript wasn't written continuously over time, as you'd expect from a scholarly work. Instead, it appears to have been completed in a single intensive effort, possibly over just a few weeks or months. A crash project, Miriam murmured. Someone working under extreme time pressure. Or someone who knew exactly what they wanted to say before they started writing. The text shows no corrections, no revisions, no evolution of ideas. It reads like a fair copy of work that was composed elsewhere, in another form. Eleanor's computer chimed, indicating that her latest analysis had finished processing. The results made both women freeze. Hidden within the manuscript's botanical section, her software had detected something that shouldn't exist. A sophisticated error correction code, the same type used in modern digital communications to ensure accurate data transmission across unreliable networks. "Elena," Miriam whispered, "I think we're looking at a message. Not a book or a scientific treatise, but a communication from someone who possessed advanced knowledge of linguistics, mathematics, and information theory. Someone who expected that future readers would develop the tools necessary to decode their work." The implications were staggering. The Voynich manuscript wasn't just an unsolved puzzle, it was a time capsule, a deliberate attempt to communicate across centuries using principles that wouldn't be discovered until the modern era. But who could have possessed such knowledge in the medieval period? And what message was so important that it required such elaborate protection? Outside the library windows, New Haven settled into evening shadow. Elena stared at the manuscript pages, feeling as though she was engaging in a conversation across 600 years of history. Someone had anticipated this moment, had known that future scholars would develop the mathematical tools necessary to pierce their veil of secrecy. The question was no longer what the Voynich manuscript contained. The question was who had written it, and why they had gone to such extraordinary lengths to ensure their message would survive the centuries intact. The breakthrough came at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday, when Elena's pattern recognition software identified something that made her spill coffee across her keyboard. Hidden within the manuscript's botanical illustrations was a classification system that preceded Carl Linnaeus by 3 centuries, and included plants that wouldn't be discovered by European botanists until the age of global exploration. Dr. Sarah Chen, the botanist Eleanor had quietly consulted, arrived at the library the following morning carrying a thick folder of printouts and wearing an expression of barely controlled excitement. Sarah specialised in ethnobotany and had spent years studying how different cultures classified and utilised plant species. Her preliminary analysis of the Voynich botanical illustrations had kept her awake for 3 nights straight. "Elena, these aren't just imaginary plants," Sarah said, spreading detailed comparison charts across the table. "Look at this illustration on folio 99R. The manuscript shows a flowering plant with distinctive 7-lobed leaves and compound umbel inflorescences. I've identified it as Panax quinquefolius, American ginseng." Elena studied the medieval illustration, then the modern botanical photograph Sarah placed beside it. The resemblance was unmistakable, down to the characteristic root structure and berry formation. But American ginseng wasn't known to European scholars until the 18th century, Elena said. Columbus hadn't even reached the Americas when this manuscript was created. Exactly, and it gets stranger. This illustration here matches Cinchona officinalis, the South American tree that produces quinine. The manuscript shows not just the plant's appearance, but also what appears to be an extraction process for its medicinal compounds. European doctors didn't learn about quinine until Spanish colonists brought samples back from Peru in the 1630s. Sarah pulled out more comparisons. "I've identified at least 37 plants in this manuscript that shouldn't have been known to medieval European scholars. Some weren't catalogued by Western science until the 19th century. A few appear to be extinct species that we know only from fossil records." The implications sent a chill through Elena's analytical mind. Either the manuscript was a remarkable work of imagination that accidentally predicted botanical discoveries centuries in advance, or its authors had access to plant specimens from around the globe, including some that no longer existed. "There's something else," Sarah continued, lowering her voice despite the empty library. "The manuscript doesn't just show these plants, it provides preparation instructions. These aren't decorative illustrations, they're technical diagrams showing how to process and combine various species for specific purposes. Some of the procedures match traditional medicine practices from cultures that had no contact with medieval Europe." Eleanor pulled up her linguistic analysis on the laptop. "That correlates with what I'm finding in the text. The sections accompanying botanical illustrations contain repeated terminology that appears to describe chemical processes. Not alchemy or medieval medicine, but something closer to modern pharmaceutical preparation. Miriam, who had been listening silently, spoke up. "I've been researching the manuscript's provenance. The earliest confirmed owner was Emperor Rudolf II of Bohemia, who purchased it in 1586 for 600 gold ducats, an enormous sum, equivalent to millions in today's currency. Rudolf was obsessed with the occult and employed scholars from across Europe to study mysterious texts. But according to his court records, even his experts couldn't decipher the manuscript." "Who did he buy it from?" Eleanor asked. That's where the investigation ends. The seller, a learned physician from the East, asserted that the book held ancient medical knowledge. The seller provided no name or further description. After Rudolf's death, the manuscript passed through several hands before ending up in the collection of Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit scholar known for studying ancient languages. Sarah was examining another botanical illustration through a magnifying glass. "Elena, look at this plant on folio 78V. The root system is incredibly detailed. It shows mycorrhizal associations, the symbiotic relationships between plant roots and soil fungi. That level of understanding of plant biology wasn't achieved until the late 19th century. Eleanor sensed the fragments of an insurmountable puzzle beginning to shift in her mind. The manuscript wasn't just demonstrating advanced knowledge of linguistics and mathematics. It was revealing an understanding of botany, chemistry and biology that exceeded medieval capabilities by centuries. Whoever created this text possessed scientific knowledge that wouldn't be available to European scholars for hundreds of years. But perhaps most disturbing was the growing certainty that the botanical knowledge displayed in the manuscript wasn't theoretical. The detailed preparation methods and precise anatomical illustrations suggested hands-on experience with these plants. Someone had actually cultivated, harvested, and processed species from around the world, including some that were supposedly extinct. The Voynich manuscript was beginning to look less like a medieval curiosity and more like a technical manual created by someone with impossible access to global botanical resources and advanced scientific understanding. The question was no longer who had written it, but when and from where. Eleanor's discovery on the 15th day of her investigation fundamentally altered her understanding of what they were dealing with. While she was running the manuscript's astronomical charts through computational analysis software that is typically used to detect securities fraud, Elena uncovered mathematical relationships that should not have been possible in the medieval period. Dr. James Morrison, the MIT mathematician she had discreetly contacted, arrived at the Beinecker Library carrying a messenger bag full of printouts and wearing the distracted expression of someone who had been calculating in his head during the entire train ride from Boston. James specialized in the history of mathematical notation and had spent his career tracking how numerical concepts evolved across different cultures and times. The astronomical section contains calendrical calculations that use mathematical techniques not developed until the Renaissance, James said, spreading his analysis across the table. But more significant is what I found in the text structure itself. The author embedded mathematical proofs within the linguistic patterns, geometric theorems disguised as grammatical constructions. Eleanor studied James's diagrams, which mapped relationships between character frequencies and spatial distributions throughout the manuscript. What kind of theorems? Primarily number theory, but with applications to what we now call chaos mathematics and fractal geometry. The text structure reveals an understanding of recursive algorithms and self-similar patterns, concepts not formally described until the 20th century. Whoever wrote these words understood mathematical concepts that wouldn't be rediscovered for 500 years. Miriam looked up from the manuscript page she had been examining. Could this be a coincidence? Perhaps medieval scholars intuited mathematical relationships without formal proof systems? James shook his head. The precision is too exact. Look at this passage in the astronomical section. When I map the character distribution to numerical values, it produces a perfect approximation of pi that is accurate to 15 decimal places. The probability of achieving that accuracy by accident is essentially zero. Eleanor felt the familiar sensation that preceded major breakthroughs in her fraud investigations, the moment when apparently unrelated evidence suddenly cohered into a recognizable pattern. James, can you analyze the overall structure of the manuscript? Not individual sections, but the document as a whole. I've been working on that. James pulled out a large sheet covered with geometric diagrams. The manuscript's organisation follows a mathematical sequence that controls everything from page length to illustration placement. It's based on principles of information compression, techniques for encoding maximum data in minimum space. The diagram showed the manuscript as a complex geometric structure, with text blocks and illustrations positioned according to mathematical relationships that optimized information density while maintaining visual coherence. Elena recognized similar patterns from her work analyzing sophisticated money laundering schemes, where criminals used mathematical principles to hide illicit transactions within legitimate financial flows. The author wasn't just recording knowledge, Elena said slowly. They were designing a storage and retrieval system. The manuscript is structured like a medieval database, with built-in indexing and cross-referencing that allows specific information to be located and extracted. Sarah, who had been quietly studying botanical illustrations, looked up with excitement. That explains why the plant drawings are so precisely positioned relative to the text. They're not decorative, they're part of the indexing system. The botanical knowledge is organised according to mathematical principles that allow rapid access to specific preparation methods or medicinal applications. James nodded. The astronomical charts serve a similar function. They're not just calendars or star maps. They're computational aids designed to help readers navigate the information contained in other sections. The mathematical relationships embedded in the charts provide keys for unlocking different layers of meaning throughout the manuscript. Elena pulled up her fraud detection software and began entering the structural parameters James had identified. If the manuscript is designed as an information storage system, there should be redundancy built in, multiple pathways to access the same data, backup encoding in case primary systems are compromised. The software ran for several minutes before producing results that made all 4 researchers fall silent. The manuscript contained not one, but 3 complete information systems, each using different encoding principles but containing overlapping data sets. It was designed to survive partial damage or incomplete transmission while maintaining access to core information. "This isn't a medieval text," Miriam said quietly. "It's an information preservation system created by someone who understood that knowledge could be lost, corrupted, or deliberately suppressed. They built multiple safeguards to ensure their data would survive across centuries." Elena stared at the manuscript pages with growing awe and unease. The Voynich manuscript wasn't just demonstrating impossible knowledge, it was revealing systematic preparation for knowledge preservation across vast spans of time. Someone in the medieval period had anticipated the need to transmit complex scientific information to future generations, using principles that wouldn't be formally understood for hundreds of years. The question was no longer who had created this remarkable document. The question was what knowledge was so important that it required such extraordinary protection, and why its authors had been so certain that normal channels of information transmission would fail. The revelation that changed everything came from an unexpected source. Dr. Lisa Park, a molecular biologist at Yale's medical school, had been quietly analysing microscopic samples from the manuscript's ink and vellum for trace genetic material. What she found challenged fundamental assumptions about the document's origins and raised questions that extended far beyond medieval scholarship. "I've extracted DNA fragments from organic components in the ink," Lisa explained, displaying molecular structures on her laptop screen. "The genetic material comes from plant sources used to create pigments, but the species profile is extraordinary. I've identified genetic markers from plants native to 6 different continents, including some that appear to be from species that went extinct thousands of years ago." Eleanor studied the genetic analysis, her fraud investigator instincts immediately recognizing the impossibility of the evidence. How could medieval ink contain genetic material from extinct species and plants from continents that hadn't been discovered yet? "That's not the strangest part," Lisa continued. "I've also found human genetic material, skin cells, hair follicles, and what appears to be saliva traces from multiple individuals who handled the manuscript during its creation. The genetic profiles don't match any known medieval European populations." Sarah leaned forward intently. "What do you mean?" The genetic markers suggest ancestry from populations that shouldn't have been in Europe during the medieval period. Some of the DNA shows characteristics consistent with indigenous American populations. Others appear to be from East Asian lineages that weren't documented in European historical records until much later periods. James looked up from the mathematical analysis he had been reviewing. Could the genetic material have been contaminated over time, perhaps from later handlers of the manuscript? Lisa shook her head. I considered that possibility, but the genetic material is embedded within the ink itself, integrated at the molecular level during the manuscript's creation. This DNA was present when the text was originally written, not added later through contamination. The implications were staggering. The manuscript hadn't just been created by someone with impossible knowledge of future scientific developments, it had been created by individuals whose genetic ancestry suggested origins from multiple continents during a period when such contact was supposedly impossible. Eleanor pulled up her fraud detection software and began cross-referencing the genetic data with her linguistic and mathematical analyses. Lisa, can you determine how many different individuals contributed genetic material to the manuscript? At least 12 distinct genetic profiles, possibly more. The diversity suggests a collaborative effort involving people from dramatically different ancestral backgrounds. Some of the genetic markers are so unusual that I've submitted samples to the International Genome Consortium for comparison with ancient DNA databases. Miriam had been unusually quiet during Lisa's presentation. Now she spoke carefully as though testing dangerous ideas. What if the manuscript wasn't created in medieval Europe? What if it was brought there from somewhere else? Somewhere that diverse populations had access to global plant resources and advanced scientific knowledge. But the vellum is definitely medieval European, Sarah pointed out. The carbon dating is unambiguous. Carbon dating tells us when the animal that provided the skin died, Elena said slowly. It doesn't tell us when or where the skin was prepared for writing, or when the text was added. Someone could have acquired medieval vellum and used it as a writing surface much later. James was studying his mathematical analyses with new interest. Actually, that might explain some of the inconsistencies I've found in the computational methods. The mathematical techniques embedded in the text appear to come from different developmental periods. Some concepts that were advanced for the medieval era, others that seem more consistent with later mathematical understanding. Lisa pulled up another genetic analysis. There's something else. I found traces of what appears to be deliberately introduced genetic material, DNA that was added to the ink intentionally, not just through casual contact during writing. Someone embedded genetic information as part of the manuscript's content. Like a signature, Eleanor asked. More like a message. The genetic sequences contain artificial arrangements that don't occur naturally. Someone was using DNA as another layer of information storage, embedding genetic codes alongside the linguistic and mathematical encoding systems. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The Voynich manuscript wasn't just a mysterious medieval text. It was a multi-layered information system that used genetic, mathematical, and linguistic encoding to preserve knowledge across time. Its creators had employed every available method of information storage, suggesting that the knowledge they were preserving was extraordinarily valuable and desperately needed protection. Eleanor felt the familiar thrill that came with solving complex fraud cases, combined with an entirely new sense of awe. We're not just looking at a medieval manuscript. We're looking at a technological artifact created by people who understood information theory, genetics, advanced mathematics, and global botany centuries before these fields were supposed to exist. But the most troubling question remained. Who were these people, and what knowledge was so important that it required protection, using techniques that wouldn't be understood for hundreds of years? The manuscript was beginning to look less like a historical curiosity, and more like a message from a lost civilization that possessed scientific capabilities far exceeding anything documented in medieval European records. Eleanor's most significant breakthrough came during her 4th week at the Beinecker, when she discovered that the manuscript contained references to historical events that hadn't occurred when it was supposedly written. Hidden within the astronomical calculations were calendrical notations that corresponded to specific dates. dates that fell centuries after the manuscript's purported creation. Dr. Richard Hawthorne, the Yale historian she had consulted, arrived carrying copies of medieval chronicles and astronomical records, his usual academic composure replaced by barely contained excitement. Richard specialised in medieval chronography and had spent decades studying how different cultures recorded and calculated time. The astronomical section contains date calculations that reference the Gregorian calendar reform of 1582, Richard explained, pointing to specific passages in the manuscript. But more troubling are annotations that appear to predict historical events with impossible accuracy. This calculation here corresponds to the date of the 1755 Lisbon earthquake. This one matches the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815. Elena studied the astronomical charts on her laptop screen, where she had overlaid Richard's historical correlations with her mathematical analysis. Could these be coincidences? Perhaps the authors were making general predictions about astronomical events. Not astronomical events, terrestrial ones. The manuscript contains calendrical references to specific historical occurrences that no medieval scholar could have predicted. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, even what appears to be references to political events that wouldn't occur for centuries. James looked up from the computational analysis he had been refining. I found similar temporal anomalies in the mathematical structure, the number sequences embedded in the text reference mathematical constants that weren't calculated until the 18th and 19th centuries. But more significantly, some of the calculations appear to be reverse engineered. They start with known results and work backward to derive principles. The implications made Elena's analytical mind reel. Reverse engineered from what known results? Scientific discoveries and mathematical proofs that weren't made until centuries after the manuscript was supposedly written. It's as though the authors had access to completed scientific knowledge and were encoding the principles that would eventually lead to those discoveries. Sarah had been quietly studying botanical illustrations while listening to the historians. Now she looked up with a disturbed expression. I've been analysing the plant preparation sequences in conjunction with modern pharmacological knowledge. The manuscript's medicinal formulations aren't just advanced for their time. They demonstrate understanding of drug interactions and biochemical processes that weren't discovered until the 20th century. She pointed to a particular illustration. This compound preparation protocol would produce a substance chemically identical to aspirin, but using plant sources that wouldn't be analysed for their salicylic acid content until the 1830s. The manuscript authors understood the molecular basis of the drug's effectiveness, without having access to the chemical knowledge that would explain why it worked. Lisa, who had been reviewing her genetic analysis, added another disturbing element to the puzzle. The human DNA I extracted from the manuscript shows something unprecedented. Some of the genetic markers suggest ancestry from populations that wouldn't exist for centuries after the manuscript was created. What do you mean? Eleanor asked. Genetic lineages that result from population mixing that occurred during later historical periods. Some of the DNA shows characteristics consistent with colonial-era genetic mixing between European, African and indigenous American populations. However, the original ink contains this genetic material, not an addition from later contamination. The room fell silent as the researchers contemplated the impossible evidence accumulating before them. The manuscript wasn't just demonstrating advanced knowledge, it was revealing information that could only have been obtained from future times. Eleanor pulled up her fraud detection software and began entering the temporal anomalies as data points. Her analytical training had taught her to look for patterns in apparently impossible evidence and find logical explanations for seemingly contradictory information. What if, Eleanor said slowly, the manuscript wasn't created in the past at all? Could it have originated in a future era and subsequently found its way into the historical record? Miriam frowned. But the carbon dating is definitive. The vellum is unquestionably medieval. Carbon dating tells us when the writing surface was created, not when it was used. Someone with access to genuine medieval vellum could have created this manuscript at any point in history, then arranged for it to be discovered in historical collections. James was studying his mathematical analyses with new insight. That would explain the reverse engineering patterns I found. The authors had access to completed scientific knowledge and were encoding it using techniques that would allow future researchers to rediscover the principles systematically. Eleanor sensed the remarkable puzzle gradually coming together. The Voynich manuscript isn't a medieval text that accidentally predicted future discoveries. It's a deliberately planted document created by people with advanced scientific knowledge who wanted to ensure that specific information would be preserved and rediscovered at the appropriate historical moment. But this explanation raised even more disturbing questions. Who possessed such advanced knowledge? Could you please let us know when the manuscript was actually created, and why had its authors gone to such elaborate lengths to disguise their message as a medieval curiosity? The manuscript pages glowed softly in the library's afternoon light, their secrets protected by layers of deception that had confounded scholars for centuries. But Eleanor sensed that they were finally approaching the truth, a truth that might fundamentally alter understanding of history, science, and the nature of human knowledge itself. On the 28th day of her investigation, Eleanor finally cracked the Voynich code. The breakthrough came not through linguistic analysis or mathematical computation, but through a flash of insight that transformed her understanding of what the manuscript actually was. It wasn't a book, a scientific treatise, or even a message in the conventional sense. It was an instruction manual for rebuilding civilization. The realization struck her at 3:17 a.m. while she was cross-referencing botanical preparations with mathematical sequences and genetic markers. The manuscript wasn't organized chronologically or thematically. It was structured as a systematic rebuilding guide, providing essential knowledge in the order it would be needed by a society recovering from catastrophic collapse. Elena called an emergency meeting of her research team for the following morning. When they assembled in the library's conference room, she had prepared a presentation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about human history. The Voynich manuscript is a post-apocalyptic survival guide, Eleanor began, displaying her comprehensive analysis on the conference room screen. It's written by survivors of an advanced civilization who were preparing future generations to rebuild scientific knowledge after a catastrophic collapse. She clicked to her first slide, showing the manuscript's organizational structure. The botanical section isn't just showing useful plants, it's providing instructions for establishing agriculture, creating medicines, and developing chemical processes using only naturally occurring resources. The astronomical charts aren't just calendars, they're navigation aids and agricultural timing guides for people who would need to rebuild basic farming and seasonal awareness. James leaned forward intently. That would explain the mathematical reverse engineering I found. The authors were encoding advanced scientific principles in forms that could be rediscovered systematically, providing a pathway from basic observations to sophisticated scientific understanding. Sarah nodded excitedly. And the plant preparations make perfect sense from that perspective. They're not just showing medicinal recipes, they're providing the chemical knowledge necessary to develop pharmaceuticals using primitive technology. Someone who lost access to modern manufacturing could use these instructions to create essential medicines from scratch. Lisa pulled up her genetic analysis. The DNA evidence supports this theory. The multiple genetic lineages suggest a diverse group of survivors, possibly from different geographical origins, who came together during a crisis period. The deliberately embedded genetic sequences could be preserving important biological information, perhaps even genetic templates for rebuilding biodiversity. Elena clicked to her next slide, showing temporal correlations. The historical predictions embedded in the astronomical calculations aren't prophecies, they're warnings. The manuscript authors experienced a civilizational collapse and were trying to prepare future societies for similar catastrophic events. They encoded information about recurring geological and astronomical phenomena that pose existential threats. Miriam had been quietly studying the manuscript pages during Elena's presentation. Now she looked up with a mixture of awe and concern. If this interpretation is correct, when was the manuscript actually created? And what catastrophe were its authors trying to help us survive? Elena displayed her final analysis, a timeline that integrated all their discoveries into a coherent narrative. Based on the scientific knowledge demonstrated, the genetic diversity of the authors, and the specific technologies they were trying to preserve, I believe the manuscript was created sometime between the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The authors were survivors of an advanced technological civilization that experienced catastrophic collapse. But that's impossible, Richard protested. The manuscript has been documented in historical collections for centuries. Emperor Rudolph II acquired it in 1586. What if the manuscript was created by people who had mastered time travel or temporal communication? Elena asked. What if the authors were future survivors who found a way to send information backward through time, placing essential knowledge into the historical record at a point where it would be preserved and rediscovered when needed? The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Eleanor continued. The elaborate encoding wasn't just to hide the information, it was to ensure that it would only be decipherable by a civilization that had developed sufficient scientific sophistication to benefit from the knowledge. We're not just reading a medieval manuscript, we're receiving a message from our future, from survivors of a civilization that may be us. James was studying the mathematical analysis with new understanding. The information preservation systems make perfect sense from that perspective. The authors were creating a time capsule designed to survive across centuries or millennia, waiting for a civilization to develop the tools necessary to decode it. Elena looked around the table at her colleagues, seeing her mixture of excitement and terror reflected in their faces. The Voynich manuscript isn't just an unsolved mystery, it's a warning and a gift from survivors of human civilization's collapse, providing us with the knowledge we'll need to rebuild after our own catastrophic failure. She paused, allowing the weight of that revelation to sink in. The question is no longer what the manuscript says. The question is whether we're wise enough to learn from it before we experience the collapse that its authors survived. Outside the library windows, the modern world continued its daily routines, unaware that hidden in Yale's rare book collection was a message from the future, a desperate attempt by the survivors of humanity's greatest failure to ensure that civilization could rise again from its ashes. The Voynich manuscript had finally revealed its secret. It was humanity's last hope, encoded in an impossible text, and sent backward through time by people who had lived through the end of the world and were determined to give their ancestors the tools to build it anew. Elena stared at the medieval pages, realizing that she was looking at the most important document in human history, a manual for surviving the unthinkable, written by people who had already lived through it and were reaching across time itself to offer their knowledge to a species that would need it to survive. The message was clear. Learn, prepare, and remember. The future depends on it.